Now, Moscow says it's still considering how to retaliate following Britain's decision to expel 23 Russian diplomats. The Russian Foreign Ministry said measures would be implemented as soon as possible. This morning, the British Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, said international allies are key.
There's a global disgust at what has happened, and that's very important. And we will continue to make the case to our friends and allies that as a committee of nations, we need to stand up to Russia.
Well, as the Foreign Secretary said, Britain is busy building an international coalition to strike back against Russia. The NATO Council will meet in Brussels today to discuss the Salisbury attack. And last night, Donald Trump's ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, gave a powerful denunciation of Russia at a Security Council meeting.
Let me make one thing clear from the very beginning. The United States stands in absolute solidarity with Great Britain. The United States believes that Russia is responsible for the attack on 2 people in the United Kingdom using a military-grade nerve agent. Dozens of civilians and first responders were also exposed. Police officer Nick Bailey was the first to arrive on the scene and remains hospitalized in serious condition. Our thoughts and prayers go out to the victims of this atrocious crime.
And beyond the United States, leaders around the world have been quick to react. Germany's new Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, said, "We take the assessment of the British government. Moscow should be ready to be transparent, and it is clear this cannot go without consequences." The Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, was clear who was responsible. He said the attack is despicable. Russia's likely involvement in this is also absolutely unacceptable and needs to be condemned in the strongest terms. And despite some initial reticence yesterday to blame Russia, the French President Emmanuel Macron said this morning France agrees with the United Kingdom that there is no other plausible explanation and reiterates its solidarity with its ally. Well, joining us now is former British Ambassador to Russia, Sir Tony Brenton, and here in the studio with me, Russian journalist Tonya Samsonova. Welcome to both of you. Tony Brenton, first of all, you were Russian Ambassador in 2006. That was when Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned. After his death, there were also expressions of support from world leaders, European leaders. Did they follow through with any meaningful action?
Can I first of all start by greeting Jack, for whom I had the privilege of working for many years in the Foreign Office.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
Yes, we got lots of warm words from the Americans and from our European allies after the Litvinenko murder. The Americans were ready to follow through, I think, with more substantive action. We played with the idea, for example, of throwing Russia out of the G8 at that time. The Europeans, I have to say, were much more disappointing. Warm words, but not much else from them.
And do you think that is going to be the case this time round, despite the declarations of support that we've had from the likes of Germany and now France?
Well, I hope not. I mean, the political context is completely different. Russia has sunk to the bottom of the international league table in terms of trust and popularity. The EU already has extensive sanctions against Russia. We, I'm sure, are out working very hard saying what happened in Salisbury 10 days ago could easily happen in Frankfurt or Avignon tomorrow. There are obvious things that the EU can do, most notably renew its own sanctions on Russia for a more extended period. And I'm sure we're working quite hard to achieve that result.
Tonya, is this what Vladimir Putin wants? I mean, what is the motivation behind what people call, you know, the levels of distrust, the disruption, the deflection by Moscow?
Regret to say, but I think that what's going on is the best birthday present for Vladimir Putin before the elections. This Sunday, the elections will be held in Moscow, and Putin's campaign is based on the theory that Russia is surrounded by the enemies, and all the European countries and the United States are like in the situation when they want to invade Russia, or they present a real threat to the country, and he's the only leader who can do something with it. Before the Salisbury accident, there was no hint that anybody in the United Kingdom or in France actually cares about like invading Russia. But now, when we have like ministers and all sorts of like very high-profile defense ministers and foreign leaders saying that Russia should be punished or we should reunite against Russia, the only thing that first channel or propaganda channel need to do is just to translate it into to Russia and show it before the election day.
And that is the problem, isn't it, Tony Brenton? I mean, you said yourself that the political situation is different. The level of mistrust is much greater. But actually, there is still a massive leap between what Tonia has said was actually Russia was being ignored largely. I mean, there wasn't really that much talk about any sort of tough action, bearing in mind their actions in Syria with Assad or the annexation of Crimea and involvement in Ukraine. And yet this attack in Salisbury is a game changer in your mind.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Tonia is right that our actions will reinforce support for Mr. Putin in Sunday's elections. But Putin was always going to win those elections in any case. And she's right, too, that in the longer term, we in the West are going to have to find ways of getting tensions with Russia down. And we're on the edge, frankly, of a new Cold War. And we all remember how dangerous and expensive the old one was. That's all, however, for the longer term. The immediate challenge is to demonstrate to the Russians that outrageous attacks such as that took place in Salisbury 10 days ago cannot be permitted, and that the international community will react.
Tonia, you agree?
That depends on what's the British society and the British Parliament wants to achieve. If you want to persuade your people that Russia is bringing no threat to the citizens of this country and no such kind of attack on this soil could ever happen, there's one way to do. If your way of reaction and the goal that you want to achieve to actually punish or to say that thing cannot happen any time soon, or you can't do that, then there is different sorts of actions that could be implemented. Obviously, I feel as a Russian citizen, I feel extremely sorry for British people, for the fact that probably my country did that to you, and I feel really bad about that, and I feel ashamed of that. But on the other hand, we are dealing with the government, which has some buttons which you should push on, and why you're not doing that.
Right. I mean,
and instead, like the situation, like I'm a mother of 3 children, I want the new war to happen. Why would we extend the tension now?
Are we on the edge of a new Cold War, or are we in it already?
Well, we're on the edge, as Tony Brenton suggested. But Tonia, no one is threatening invasion of Russia. I mean, just point out that the only country that's been invaded in Europe recently is Ukraine, invaded by Russia, not by the West. I just wanted to ask you this. You're suggesting that this poisoning in Salisbury has played into Putin's hands. Do you think that was one of the motives of those in the GRU who organised it in order to help Putin?
I can speculate about only speculate. I don't have any evidence and I don't have any clues. But one of the explanations I found reasonable. We have to bear in mind that Kremlin administration and GRU are parties of the Russian government who don't like each other, and GRU don't like Foreign Office. So they actually think of others like Monteki Capuletti things. They don't speak to each other, so they can't possibly coordinate things. I'm absolutely sure that probably Mr. Lavrov, the head of the foreign secretary, yes, or probably even the head of the Kremlin administration, knew from the news or from the briefings from the embassy that actually something happened in Salisbury, not because they don't brief each other. So thinking that GRU would be thinking about the elections is quite unlikely to happen because it's not their responsibility.
Right. I mean, but they all work in silos. I mean, we were just discussing before. You say Sergei Lavrov will have a certain amount of influence, but you know, how far does that go?
Well, Sergei Lavrov is a very distinguished and experienced international diplomat, but he's not part of the so-called St. Petersburg mafia, and Tony Brenton knows much more about that. So he's not the inner clique. And also, because of the way the intelligence agencies work in Russia, he, as you say, Tonia, would have had no knowledge at all
he has to react.
And he's a spokesman for these purposes.
Right. In terms of looking ahead, Tony Brenton, we have news here that the NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg, is going to meet Boris Johnson. Again, part of Britain's attempts to build some sort of coalition. But again, beyond invoking Article 5, which we've already heard from NATO, they don't feel this is the right moment for that. What else could there be?
Well, I've already said what the EU could be doing, which is renewing its sanctions and perhaps extending its sanctions. We will be introducing measures. This is going to be a slower process against Russians with illicit money in London. And I rather hope that the Americans, for example, and others will note the names that we've got and will act similarly. There's a whole cluster of things like that. We have The key target of our actions so far has been, and this comes back to something that Tonya was saying, has been the GRU. We've kicked out 23 people from the Russian embassy in London who almost certainly were agents of the GRU and the FSB, the two key Russian intelligence agencies in this context. The aim of that is to severely damage their ability to operate in London, and I imagine that the extent of the expulsions have come as a real shock to the Russians, the aim being, of course, to discourage them from doing the sort of thing again. But I'm sure that we will be communicating with the Americans and with the Europeans these names and encouraging them also to get tougher on the extensive Russian intelligence presences in their capitals.
Right, well, before I get Tonya's response to how hard that will have hit Russian, the level of expulsions, Tony Brennan, there'll be people who'll be surprised who will say, why did we have so many spies here in the first place? Why weren't they kicked out earlier?
Well, the answer is we don't let people whom we know to be spies come in. But once someone is on the staff of the embassy, we obviously watch what they're up to, and patterns of behaviour emerge which lead us to conclude that some of them are spies. At that point, you have a difficult decision, because if you kick them out, they will then kick one of our people out. And, you know, they're kicking out from Moscow innocent diplomats.
Right.
So in a sense, you're stuck. Once you've let them in and they turn out to be a spy,
they're here
you're
to
stuck
stay
with them for as long as they're there.
I mean, are you surprised there hasn't been a retaliation, a public retaliation so far, apart from the scorn from Moscow and from Vladimir Putin? They say there's going to be a retaliation. I mean, should we be expecting it literally imminently?
Well, this is going to be a very interesting moment. I mean, they will retaliate. Almost certainly a roughly equivalent number of British diplomats will be thrown out, and I'm sure they're working on the list even as we speak. The worrying thought is that they are so angry with the UK, as we have been one of the ultra hawks on the West on Russian policy for the last few years, that they will go considerably beyond the steps that we have taken, and we're then in an escalating cycle of mutual reprisals. And who knows where that could end. I very much hope that's not going to be the situation, but that's what we're going to have to watch when we hear what the Russian retaliation is.
Well, and that's the escalation you're worried about.
I can't agree that Russia is very angry with the UK now, because Russia just got what she wanted. On the high level, there would be no attendance at the World Championship, but like UK didn't impose any sanctions that would be like really hurtful and painful for Russian government.
Would that be like seizing property here,
yes,
or
and
saying
tracking,
to the elite
yeah.
close to Putin, no more visas, you can't come here, you can't study here, your family can't come and live here? Would that hurt?
That hurt, because like only thing that Putin cares about is like his close cronies who live here and who has their monies. And for me, it's like easy to say that, because there are people who has illegal assets here and who just take money from Russia and park them here and buy properties here. And I know that generally British public is not happy with that as well. But when you say that Russia is very angry with the British reaction, it's actually not true. When you're watching this on the state TV and you watch official statements, they are produced for domestic use before the elections. They're not addressed to you. So whenever you see somebody is very insulting, he just shows how strong he is towards his domestic audience.
All
and
right.
when I see British politicians talking the same way, I'm very much surprised, because I don't want Russia to teach the whole world how diplomacy should be like this.
Well, let's talk about diplomacy in the United States, because in the midst of the statements and reactions this week, we heard that the US Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, had been dismissed. What impact do you think that is going to have on a different bit of foreign policy, which is on the Iran deal?
It could have a serious impact on it, because President Trump mentioned Iran as one of the points of disagreement between him and Rex Tillerson, the now former US Secretary of State. On the other, I don't know Mr. Pompeo, but I've spoken to people who do know him very well. They say that this is a man who is very bright, intelligent, interested in foreign policy, and he's open to arguments. And the problem about the Iran deal is that it's not... I mean, he claims, President Trump, it's a very good deal for Iran. It's a good deal for Iran, but a lot of the benefits have not been delivered by the West. It's a very, very good deal for the West, because it's a non-proliferation, it's an arms control.
But Trump doesn't like it.
No, Trump doesn't like it. We think Trump doesn't like it for the simple reason that Obama agreed it, and not for any other reason. So I hope and pray that the rational arguments that this is in America's interest will work, and also critically, Joe, that Russia, China, France, Germany and the United Kingdom are all very clear and united that the deal has to stay.
Right.
And the US has got to take account of that.
OK, we're going to leave it there. But thank you very much, Tonya and Tony Brenton, for joining us to talk about
Thank you.
Russia and the response.